to describe the profit paradox, consider the Dow Jones. The Dow Jones is reaching new heights every other week, and usually you would think that high stock market valuations are a sign of profitability of a vibrant economy. And it is true in normal times when firms innovate and make the economy grow. But it is not the case when the Dow Jones creates market valuations that are from firms that have market power because they basically don't face competition. They have high profits, but they don't really compete with other firms, and therefore they charge too high prices from everything that you buy. And this is bad for the economy because the Dow Jones is only an index of 30 firms out of, well, there's about 6 million firms in the entire US economy. And even if you would consider the S&P, which consists of 500 firms, there's only a few hundred of those dominant firms that create high profits and that are valuable in the stock market, but it is because they face very limited competition. And what the profit paradox argues is that this has an effect on the macroeconomy. This has an effect on smaller firms, this has an effect on startups, this has an effect on workers whose wages stagnate, and this has an effect throughout the entire economy. And that doesn't mean that a company like Apple or Google is paying its workers badly. To the contrary, everyone wants to work for them. They offer high wages and attractive working conditions. The problem is that there are a small number of firms that are large and dominant in the economy, which has a macroeconomic effect on the entire labor market, on the entire economy of other firms. And so what the book does is it tells a story of what's going on, of what the causes and the consequences are, and I mix these facts together with stories of individuals. I come back to some of these stories in a little bit, but let me give you one striking fact, and that is the fact that startups have declined since the 1980s. And you would think, well, in an economy of such new technologies that we're living through at the moment, that we have lived through since the 80s and 90s, you would think that there's a lot of startups. Think of what Silicon Valley is. It's the country of startups. Now, the facts tell us a different story. The facts tell us that the number of startups, which were 14% of all firms in the late 80s, and now it's between 7 and 8%. So basically, the number of startups have halved. And what basically the book argues and what our research shows is that there's a connection between the market dominance of these few large firms and business dynamism and startups in the economy. Now, why would this happen? What has gone on in the process to create this dominance of these firms? And the key word here is fast technological change. And technological change here is going to be both the hero and the villain, because technological change is the only source for innovation, the only source for economic growth, the only source for progress. But at the same time, these innovations done by those dominant firms, because remember, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Inditexes, the large firms, the dominant firms, they are the ones who innovated immensely. But they have used these new technologies, this fast technological change, at the same time to keep competitors out. And they've been able to do that because the key word here is scale. Because you have a large scale as a firm, you manage to basically dominate a market where it's impossible for other firms to come in. And you can think of a firm like eBay that organizes online auctions, and really why is this scale important? Because there are what we call network effects. Network effects tell us that the larger the marketplace is, the more valuable it is. If I have something to sell on eBay, I want to go to a marketplace where there is a lot of buyers, and buyers want to go where there's a lot of sellers offering things for sale. And therefore, the best outcome for the economy is to have one large marketplace. That means that competitors who want to come in have difficulties coming in. And for a long time, companies like Yahoo Auctions have tried to compete with eBay, and they never managed to get any decent market share in this market. And the reason for that is, again, because scale matters. The value of that market derives from the fact that it's large. Now, eBay is arguing that they are a dominant firm because they are so large, because they have a better technology. But there's one slight detail that actually tells us that this is not true. And why is this not true? Well, if we look at what happens in Japan, the market for online auctions is dominated by Yahoo auctions because Yahoo was there first. In fact, the technology that Yahoo uses is identical or very similar to the one that eBay uses. And eBay cannot get a share in that market in Japan. This tells us that the technologies are the same. This tells us that there's really value to being first in the market, and once you have gained that market share through enormous innovation, the hero part, then comes the villain part. The villain part says, well, I have competed for this market, but I can use the same technology, the scale, the network effects, to avoid that there's competition in the market. And that's where these dominant firms derive their market power from. Now, this is not new. We've seen this also around the 1900s. Then the fast technological change was with different technologies. It was the discovery and production of oil, it was railway travel, it was electricity, it was telephone communication. But what these new technologies generated was a number of new markets and new opportunities in which new firms entered first and developed basically their scale advantage that kept competitors out. And to give you an example, to cross from the East Coast to the West Coast before there was a direct train connection, what happened was that you went on a horse-drawn carriage. And on a horse-drawn carriage, it took you between 4 and 6 months to cross from the East Coast to the West Coast. It was taking a long time, it was really burdensome, and it was very expensive. And once the railway lines came, then you could cross in about 4 weeks. It was again a lot cheaper, it was much faster, and it was less burdensome. But what happened to the price was not reflecting what was happening to the cost. The cost is estimated to have dropped to about 10% of what the cost was in using the horse-drawn carriage. But the prices of crossing by rail was not 1/10 of what it was by horse-drawn carriage. Of course, everyone was using the superior technology at a lower price, but at a slightly lower price, not at the price what the cost was. And that's where the market power comes from. Why? Because you would not want to construct 2 parallel railway lines. What you really would like is you would have to have firms competing on that network. Now, why would you care as an individual, sitting in this room, or as an individual who is basically using all these technologies? Because, by the way, we all love these superior technologies. We all love an Amazon because they can bring these goods at a very low price to our doorstep. Why would you care that they're actually not charging an even lower price, which they could charge? Well, you care in the first place because prices are too high. So your expenditure is higher than what it should be in a competitive market, or what it would be in a competitive market. But you should also care if you're a business owner, because true, there's a few hundred business owners that do extremely well. We know all their names. They're famous billionaires. But most business owners, let's say those with employment less than 50,000, so those are not small firms, what we see in the data is that these firms are having a much harder time now than they used to have, let's say, in the early 80s. So what's happened to most businesses is that it's actually a more difficult environment to compete in. Why? Because you have these large dominant firms. It's also worse if you have, say, a nephew who has a brilliant idea and wants to start a new firm. Well, that startup is much less likely to come off the ground because, as we've seen in the data, the number of startups has halved. And that's again closely related to the competition that there is from these dominant firms who manage to keep out new firms. So you would care as a business owner. Now, what if you own stock? I can buy stock in these dominant firms. I can buy stock in Apple. I can buy stock in Amazon. And all the growth that we've seen over the last few years would be reflected in my portfolio. My return on my portfolio would be high. And in fact, that's why people who own stock think it's great that the Dow Jones is going through the roof. The problem with that is, of course, that you can buy stock now, or maybe you've bought stock a few years ago, but the majority of the stock is held by the founders. And the biggest beneficiaries of the rising stock market valuations are the founders of these dominant firms. And even if you think, well, I can still ride some of that rising tide of increasing stock market valuations, remember that the total cost to the economy, to the other firms, to the labor market, to startups is substantial and is large. And in fact, we estimate that the cost of these dominant firms to society is around 9% of GDP. So that basically means that every year we lose 9% of the value of the economy due to the dominance of these firms. So I think there's good enough reasons why you would want to care about these dominant firms, even if you own stock in them. Now, is there something we can do about it? Is there any hope? And the answer to that is yes, there is something we can do. As I said, the short answer to this technological innovation is more competition. Let me first say the answer is not, I think, in general, splitting up firms. Some firms may have to be split up because they shouldn't have been together in the first place, like Facebook shouldn't have merged with WhatsApp and Instagram, and so I think that still can be undone. But I don't think it makes any sense to break up a firm like eBay, make two platforms, because the value comes precisely from having one large platform. And it definitely doesn't make sense to split up the platform that Amazon holds, because that would mean that delivering what they're delivering to your doorstep is going to be actually more costly for them. So what we really want is we want to exploit the scale and at the same time induce competition on these platforms, on these networks, on these large kind of bases of these firms. And there's an example where this works very well. One example, and this is, I will denominate interoperability because it's a term that comes from the tech world, but what it means is that you use technology or you use a network in a market in a versatile way such that there's competition. And the example is coming from telecom. The comparison between a phone plan in the United States, which I used to have with AT&T, and it cost about 2 to 3 times what it costs here in Europe. The technology is the same. I use the same device. The cell towers are the same and use the same bandwidth and signals, so there's no difference there. We use 4G, 5G. Where's the difference? Well, it's one piece of regulation. It's one little piece of regulation, interoperability, that says if you own a network of towers in a certain region or a country, what you have to do is you have to admit competitors to use your network of towers. So that means if a company from the United Kingdom, from Poland, or from even the United States wants to compete in a Spanish market, for example, what they can do is they can just walk up to a local operator and say, I want to use your network. The regulator sets a price at which this can be done, and you can immediately start to compete for customers. What happens, they will lower prices. And what happens is, of course, that the incumbent firm will not like it because they will be forced to lower prices in response, else they lose their customers. And that is what competition in the market on the network is really about. It's competing firms against each other, but notice that we've kept all the scale advantages of this one network. We've kept one large network that gives us the huge advantage of low cost. We don't have to duplicate the network. Now you can see what the consequences are. In the European Union, there's about 150 operators. In the United States, there's 3 large ones, right? And as a result of that, the prices in the United States are so much higher. Now, as you can see, the operators in Europe or in the US who own the networks, they do not like this regulation. AT&T will do everything to stop regulators to implement this interoperability because it will eat into their profits. It will lower their profits. It will lower their market valuation. But the customer would love it, and that's the whole point. There's a difference between what the firm wants that can exploit its market power and what is beneficial to the economy, what is beneficial to the customer. So there's things, examples like this that we can do, and I think that a reform of the antitrust authorities would help achieve more competitive markets. One way to do this, I think, in the first place, is to dedicate more resources to that. And I would advocate for something like an independent antitrust authority or an independent competition authority, just in the same way that we have an independent central bank. When people figured out in the 70s and the 80s that inflation was best kept out of the hands of politicians in order to ensure that we have 2% inflation guaranteed, then they created an independent institution that guarantees that specialists with resources, with manpower, can implement this objective of a 2% inflation. Now, economists have estimated that the cost of inflation is around 0.5% of GDP. Well, if we see that the cost of market power is around 9%, then there are good reasons and high economic value to implement such policy through an independent competition authority as well. And I think this is something that politically may be hard to achieve, but would be extremely beneficial and valuable to the economy. So let me now just conclude and say that this is a book that documents a lot of these facts, that documents a lot of these data, what we see is going on in the economy. But at the same time, these facts are closely connected to humanity, and these facts are really also related to people's stories. One of the objectives of the Profit Paradox is to communicate the facts through the lens of the experience of very common and maybe not so common people. And let me just give you one example of the type of person that I've met over the last 2 years when I was writing the book, who gave me a different insight, in fact, also in what the facts are about. This is the story of Evtychios, who came from Greece as an orphan and as a child, and he was brought up by a distant family member, went to study and made it to a school teacher, made it to a principal. At the age of 65, he was forced to retire, and he had big objectives in his life. In fact, he was running a charity which was an orphanage, and he needed money to do that. He had 6 children, all of them were out of the house, had jobs, had their families, but he couldn't find a job. He was too old for all the jobs that he applied for. In fact, he applied for one job as a pizza delivery boy at the age by then nearly 70, and they said there's just one condition: you have to have no facial hair. Now, he had had a beard for 50 years, so he said, I'm not going to do that. Eventually, he ended up riding for a rideshare company. That's how I met him on the way to the airport in Boston. And he told me his story, and he said, initially I was very skeptical about this type of company. Is this ethical? You know, am I taking someone else's jobs? But then when he discovered how this works, and the fact for him personally that he was able to work long hours every day, that he could go away for 2 months to work at his charity and then come back and continue to work without any problem or interruptions, he thought this was extremely valuable, and he could make quite a lot of money being such a driver for the rideshare company. What this taught me is that when we complain about some of these gig economy jobs, is not so much the working conditions, which most of them actually like quite a lot. What the problem is that these wages of these, let's call them gig jobs, are low because there's an aggregate macroeconomic effect that's lowering all the wages that we see, not so much, not only for the gig economy jobs, but also for people working in hospitality and restaurants, people being security guards. And what the effect is of the dominant firms is that it lowers the wages, which is this macroeconomic effect. So through these personal stories, these experiences of individuals, it has also made me see a different side of these facts. And it's in a way, as the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig describes it in his biography of Montaigne, the French medieval intellectual. He says, it's not the cold fact which has meaning, but rather the human emotional element contained in it. And I think that's the objective also of the book, to tell those stories in a way that help us understand much better what these facts are about. Thank you so much for your interest in the book, and I really hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you so much.